To the modern eye, the immense expanse of the Pacific Ocean often appears as a terrifyingly empty void. For centuries, many believed that early seafarers merely drifted across these waters by sheer accident, carried by unpredictable winds. But to the native navigators of Hawaii, this seemingly endless blue canvas was never considered a silent barrier. It was a familiar and vibrant highway, perfectly mapped by the stars and intimately connecting thousands of distant island homes. Tonight, we will peacefully sail this ancient ocean together. But before we depart, I simply want to thank you for resting here with me. For centuries, modern scholars looked out across the expanse of the Pacific Ocean and saw an insurmountable void, a terrifying emptiness that surely must have kept ancient civilizations clinging strictly to the safety of familiar shorelines. The sheer mathematics of the Pacific defy human comprehension in holding within its basin more than enough space to swallow all the land masses of the Earth combined, leaving only a serene, unbroken horizon of deep blue water. To the untrained eye, this colossal body of water was an absolute barrier, a silent desert of waves where early humanity could only drift aimlessly at the mercy of capricious winds and unforgiving currents. It was a common assumption that any discovery of isolated land was merely the result of a desperate and accidental shipwreck rather than purposeful exploration. However, the truth hidden beneath the gentle swells and starlit nights of the ancient world tells a vastly different story, one of absolute mastery and deliberate expansion. Far from being a tragic wasteland of lost sailors, the Pacific was a bustling, interconnected highway for the most remarkable maritime culture in human history. By mapping the linguistic and archaeological footprints left behind on scattered islands, researchers from institutions like the National Geographic Society have outlined a staggering domain known today as the Polynesian Triangle. This invisible geometric empire did not consist of stone walls or guarded borders, but of 10 million square miles of open ocean, bound together by an intricate web of invisible ancestral navigational routes. The colonization of this massive triangular territory was not a sudden event, but a slow, rhythmic heartbeat of migration that echoed across millennia. Beginning around the year 1000 BCE, fleets of massive, double-hulled voyaging canoes began pushing outward from the Western Pacific, carrying families, livestock, and sacred plants into the profound silence of the deep ocean. This deliberate expansion continued generation after generation, slowly filling the island outposts of the immense oceanic triangle, continuing steadily until around the year 1300 CE. It was a peaceful yet relentless conquest of the sea, executed without a single piece of metal, without the magnetic pull of a compass, and without the certainty of a drawn map. The anchors of this 10 million square mile triangle represent the ultimate boundaries of human endurance and navigational genius. In the far southwest lies Aotearoa, the sprawling and ecologically diverse landmass now known as New Zealand, while the southeastern corner is pinned by the isolated, windswept shores of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, famous for its silent stone guardians. But it is the northernmost apex of this triangle that stands as the ultimate testament to the navigator's unparalleled skill. There, rising fiercely from the abyssal plain, sits the volcanic archipelago of Hawaii, Isai. Long before it became a prized state of the American nation, this cluster of islands represented the most remote landmass on the face of the earth, surrounded by thousands of miles of unbroken, treacherous ocean in every possible direction. Reaching the Hawaiian Islands was an achievement of such staggering difficulty that it defies the very limits of ancient maritime capability. Unlike the relatively clustered archipelagos of the southern Pacific, where a stray canoe might reasonably stumble upon a neighbouring atoll, the journey to the northern apex required crossing the equator and navigating the treacherous doldrums, a dead zone where winds vanish and the sea turns into a suffocating, glassy mirror. To find Hawaii meant charting a course through absolute nothingness for weeks on end, trusting blindly in a mental map of the cosmos while enduring the intense isolation of the deep Pacific. The navigators who first caught the scent of rain on the Hawaiian volcanic peaks and saw the lush, green valleys emerging from the morning mist were not merely survivors of a blind voyage, but rather the undisputed masters of the natural world. Within the borders of this staggering 10 million square mile triangle, the ocean was never viewed as an empty, terrifying abyss, but rather as a nurturing and familiar landscape. Where Western explorers would later see only a void to be conquered, the ancient mariners saw an intimate neighbourhood of currents, swells, and celestial markers. Every changing colour of the water, every shift in the temperature of the wind, and every subtle movement of the clouds carried specific, readable information. The sea was an open book, a vast living entity that communicated clearly to those who possessed the patience and the ancestral wisdom to listen to its subtle language. The great voyaging canoes moved through this immense, starlit domain with a profound sense of belonging, transforming the world's largest ocean into a carefully maintained network of family and trade. For thousands of years, this monumental system of celestial navigation remained an unbroken chain of oral tradition, passed down in hushed tones during long nights beneath the tropical sky, keeping the immense Polynesian triangle perfectly connected. The ocean was deeply understood, deeply respected, and deeply loved by those who sailed it. But as the centuries turned, this intimate connection to the stars and the sea would eventually face a profound and unprecedented test. On a particular evening, long before the empires of the modern world began to draw their borders, a massive double-hulled voyaging canoe slipped silently away from the protective coral reefs of Tahiti, trading the familiar shallow turquoise lagoons for the deep, unfathomable indigo of the open Pacific. As the sun dipped below the western horizon, it pulled the vibrant colours of the island away with it, leaving behind only the stark silhouette of jagged volcanic peaks fading slowly against the twilight sky. The transition from the safety of the land to the boundless sovereignty of the ocean was not marked by fanfare or loud farewells, but rather by a profound settling quiet. The sounds of the bustling coastal village, the calling of birds, the grinding of stone tools, the laughter of children playing in the surf, were gradually swallowed by the vastness of the sea, replaced entirely by the rhythmic, breathing cadence of the natural world. As true darkness descended, weaving a heavy velvet blanket over the ocean, the great catamaran transformed into a solitary floating island, a tiny sanctuary of humanity suspended in an abyssal void. The sensory environment of the vessel became a hypnotic symphony of ancient materials interacting with the elements, designed not to fight the ocean, but to harmonize with it. There was the steady, rhythmic rushing of water smoothly parting at the twin wooden bows, a constant, whispering hiss that sounded like a long, unbroken breath escaping from the lungs of the sea. Above the deck, the immense sails woven from dried pandanus leaves caught the steady, cooling breath of the trade winds, creaking gently against the strong wooden masts with a deep, resonating groan that felt more like a heartbeat than a mechanical strain. Below the woven canopies, the majority of the extended family slept soundly, their breathing syncing with the endless, rocking lullaby of the Pacific, trusting their lives entirely to the wood beneath them and the men awake on the deck. At the stern of the vessel, sitting in the absolute stillness of a master at work, an elder grandfather rested his calloused hands lightly upon the massive steering paddle. His skin was weathered into deep creases by decades of salt, sun, and relentless winds, but his eyes held the tranquil clarity of a man who knew exactly where he belonged in the universe. Beside him sat his young grandson, wrapped tightly in a woven mat against the sudden nighttime chill, his small face illuminated only by the faint and silvery glow of the starlight reflecting off the black water. For the child, the sheer scale of the darkness pressing in from all sides was initially terrifying, a suffocating emptiness that threatened to swallow their fragile wooden home whole. But the old man radiated an aura of profound peace, his gaze fixed not on the terrifying blackness of the water, but upward, reading the brilliant rotating canopy of stars as easily as one might read the familiar pathways of their own childhood village. When a thick bank of midnight clouds rolled across the sky, completely obscuring the celestial map and plunging the canoe into a blindness so complete it felt heavy, the young boy tensed, his small hands gripping the wooden railing in sudden fear. The visual world had vanished entirely, leaving them adrift in a lightless void, disconnected from the sky that had been guiding them. Sensing the child's rising panic, the grandfather reached out in the dark, his rough, warm hand gently covering the boy's trembling fingers, offering a silent reassurance that the ocean was never truly empty. Without speaking a word to break the sacred quiet of the night, the old man gestured for his grandson to close his eyes, instructing him to stop looking for the light and to start listening to the invisible language of the water beneath them. With his eyes squeezed shut, the boy focused all of his remaining senses on the physical sensations translating through the wooden hull of the catamaran. At first, he felt only the dominant, heavy rolling of the primary ocean swell, the massive, uninterrupted waves driven by the prevailing trade winds that lifted and dropped the canoe in a predictable, rhythmic march. But as he slowed his breathing and let his mind sink into the pitch-black environment, guided by the steady pressure of his grandfather's hand, the boy began to feel a secondary movement. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration echoing through the wood, a faint rhythmic counterbeat that gently slapped against the side of the hull, cutting across the main current like a delicate, invisible pulse. The grandfather leaned down into the suffocating darkness, his voice barely a whisper above the hissing waves, explaining that this faint interference was the oceanic fingerprint of an island hundreds of miles away, an invisible landmass that was bending and refracting the swells across the vast expanse. They were not lost in an empty desert of water, but rather following a distinct tactile pathway paved by the very motion of the sea itself. The young boy's fear slowly dissolved into the gentle rocking of the vessel, replaced by a deep, comforting realization that the ocean was holding them safely in its currents. They sailed onward through the absolute blackness of the Pacific night, guided purely by a subtle disturbance in the water that whispered of a towering green paradise waiting patiently in the northern dark, as the heavy bank of midnight clouds that had briefly enveloped the canoe slowly fractured and drifted away, carried off by the steady, rhythmic breath of the trade winds. The suffocating darkness of the Pacific was instantly shattered. In its place, the vast canopy of the nighttime sky revealed itself in staggering clarity, in an impossibly deep dome of indigo dusted with the brilliant, icy fire of countless celestial bodies. The young boy, no longer clutching the wooden rail in fear of the invisible swells, opened his eyes and leaned back against the woven pandanus mats, gazing upward in absolute, breathless awe. The ocean around them transformed from a terrifying void into a shimmering mirror, catching the starlight on the crest of every gentle wave, and creating the illusion that the great doubled canoe was floating suspended in the very centre of the galaxy. Beside him in the stern, the grandfather released his steady grip on the steering paddle, just enough to raise a weathered arm, pointing a calloused finger toward the glittering horizon. He was not merely gesturing at a beautiful, chaotic scattering of light, but actively reading a highly complex, invisible map woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. This was the legendary Kukuluo Kahiki, the traditional star compass that served as the cornerstone of ancient oceanic exploration. Unlike the brass and glass instruments of European explorers centuries later, this compass possessed no physical form, no magnetic needle, and no carved dial to be held in the hand. It existed entirely and flawlessly within the disciplined mind of the master navigator, a profound mental construct passed down through generations of silent observation and rigorous memorization. Within the mind of the elder, the circular horizon of the sea was mathematically divided into 32 distinct houses, precise sectors where specific stars were known to rise from the eastern waters and eventually set back into the western waves. To the uninitiated traveller, the rotating night sky was merely a mesmerizing display of diamond dust, but to the wayfinders of this era, it was an exact, predictable cylinder of geographical coordinates. Every star had a home, a specific path it travelled across the heavenly dome, and, by observing which house a star emerged from, the navigator could instantly determine their exact heading. By cross-referencing the positions of hundreds of individual stars against the angle of the ocean swells and the direction of the wind, the grandfather could orient the massive catamaran with staggering precision, weaving a path through the open ocean without ever needing a physical map. Moving his hand slowly across the rotating celestial sphere, the grandfather traced a deliberate path toward the northern horizon until his finger rested upon a single, piercingly bright point of light. This was Arcturus, known in their ancient melodic tongue as Hokulia, the star of gladness. It was the paramount guiding light of their people, the zenith star that hung directly above the most remote and challenging destination in their oceanic world. Centuries later, this very star would become a sacred cultural symbol for the modern American state of Hawaii, representing the ultimate triumph of indigenous intellect and the enduring spirit of the Polynesian people. To find those distant volcanic shores, the ancient mariners only needed to follow Hokulia as it arced across the heavens, keeping the heavy wooden bow of the catamaran perfectly aligned with its radiant trajectory until the towering green peaks of the islands finally pierced the morning horizon. For hours, the canoe glided effortlessly beneath this glittering celestial map, the gentle hissing of the water harmonizing with the profound comforting silence of the cosmos. The boy watched the star of gladness burn steadily in the north, feeling a deep, abiding sense of security in the knowledge that the universe itself was guiding their fragile wooden vessel toward a safe harbour. It was a moment of perfect suspended peace, a delicate balance between human ingenuity and the immense, nurturing forces of nature. The Pacific seemed to have surrendered its terrifying mysteries, offering instead a clear, illuminated pathway to their new home. But this tranquil communion with the stars rested on a fragile meteorological balance that would not last the night, as a thick, impenetrable wall of storm clouds was already rising silently off the port bow, preparing to swallow the sky whole. The impenetrable wall of clouds that had gathered on the horizon finally swept across the zenith, extinguishing the brilliant canopy of the night sky like a heavy woolen blanket dropped over a lantern. In mere moments, the staggering clarity of the cosmos was replaced by a suffocating, featureless void. The great double-hulled canoe was swallowed entirely by the pitch blackness of the open Pacific. For the young boy huddled on the woven pandanus mats, the sudden disappearance of the guiding stars triggered a profound, primal anxiety. He felt a chilling sensation that they were now adrift in an endless, hostile abyss. He strained his eyes against the absolute dark, desperately searching for even a single sliver of starlight to orient his mind. The heavens offered nothing but a heavy, oppressive silence. The wind had shifted, carrying the damp, metallic scent of distant rain. The vast ocean that had recently seemed like a shimmering pathway now felt like a chaotic expanse of unpredictable forces. The boy instinctively reached out to grasp the wooden rail of the catamaran. His small knuckles turned white as the vessel pitched and rolled with a sudden, unnerving irregularity. Yet, while the boy felt the creeping dread of being utterly lost, the eldest standing patiently at the steering paddle did not exhibit a single trace of panic. For the master navigator, the erasure of the visual world was not a catastrophic blinding. It was merely a quiet invitation to awaken an entirely different, far more profound set of senses. But to survive this sunless, starless expanse, the old man would have to teach his grandson a secret language spoken not in light, but in the heavy, invisible rhythm of the deep water. In the absence of celestial beacons, ancient wayfinders relied upon an astonishingly sophisticated understanding of oceanic hydrodynamics. They essentially transformed their own bodies into highly sensitive instruments of navigation. Deep beneath the chaotic, wind-driven surface waves, there existed a much older fundamental rhythm. This was the ocean swell, a continuous ribbon of kinetic energy moving through the water, generated by distant, massive storms. Unlike surface chop, which is entirely erratic and dependent on local weather, these deep ocean swells travel across thousands of miles of open sea. They move in predictable, unbroken lines and rarely alter their primary direction. When these powerful underwater currents encounter a solid landmass, the immense energy of the swell is forced to bend. It reflects and refracts around the underwater slopes of the earth, even if the island is completely obscured by darkness or hundreds of miles away. This incredible phenomenon creates complex, intersecting interference patterns upon the surface of the water. It forms a distinct aquatic fingerprint that ripples outward across the sea in all directions. A master navigator understood that an island was never truly hidden. Its massive physical presence constantly echoed through the ocean, leaving a permanent, recognizable signature. It could be felt in the exact way the boat lifted, rolled, and settled back down into the trough of a wave. By carefully interpreting these subtle, overlapping physical vibrations transmitted directly through the wooden hull, a skilled mariner could read the ocean like a map. They could calculate the direction, distance, and even the size of unseen landmasses lying in wait in the dark. Sensing the trembling fear in his grandson, the weathered grandfather slowly lowered himself to the wet deck of the canoe. He softly instructed the boy to lie perfectly flat against the wooden planks and close his eyes to the useless darkness. He placed a heavy, calloused hand upon the boy's thin shoulder, urging him to stop fighting the movement of the vessel. He wanted the boy to allow his body to melt into the architecture of the ship, becoming a living extension of the carved wood. At first, the boy felt only a terrifying, chaotic jumble of violent motions. It was a senseless tossing that threatened to overwhelm his senses and turn his stomach. But as the minutes stretched out into the deep night, guided by the low, rhythmic chanting of his grandfather, the frantic noise of the surface waves slowly began to fade away. The boy began to notice that beneath the unpredictable slap of the wind-driven water, the massive catamaran was moving with a deliberate purpose. It was consistently rising and falling in a repeating pattern, a heavy breathing rhythm that surged primarily from the starboard side. Then, as his concentration deepened into a state of pure tactile meditation, the boy felt a secondary, much fainter vibration. It was trembling through the timber directly against his cheek, a gentle counter-rhythm cutting across the main swell like a quiet whisper. It was the distinct, undeniable sensation of wave energy bouncing backward. Yes, this subtle disruption in the ocean's heartbeat indicated that the swells were striking a solid, immovable object in the vast emptiness ahead. The boy opened his eyes in the pitch blackness, no longer searching the empty sky for a guiding star. He stared out over the bow with a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity and absolute peace. The heavens had completely abandoned them, yet the dark, heavy ocean itself was now singing the way forward, promising that the towering, unseen shores of the destination stood resolute just beyond the edge of the night. The long, suffocating night eventually surrendered to a pale, bruised light as the storm clouds exhausted their fury and began to fragment along the eastern horizon. A fragile rim of rose and gold bled into the slate-grey waters, revealing a dramatically altered world. The violent swells that had tossed the massive double-hulled canoe throughout the darkness gradually smoothed into a heavy, rolling glass. The boy, still holding the memory of the ocean's invisible heartbeat deep within his bones, sat up on the damp pandanus mats and wiped the cold sea spray from his face. The air had changed completely, losing the harsh, metallic bite of the open sea and taking on a subtle, sweet humidity that carried the faint ghost of rain and wet earth. His grandfather remained at the stern, his posture still rigid with absolute concentration, his weathered eyes scanning the lightening sky for the final, undeniable proof that their epic journey across the Pacific was nearing its end. In the ancient art of wayfinding, celestial bodies provided the grand cosmic map, and ocean swells offered a tactile path. But the ultimate confirmation of landfall always arrived on feathered wings. As the morning sun crested the horizon, casting long, glittering shadows across the gentle waves, a sudden flurry of movement caught the boy's attention. High above the water, sharp white silhouettes darted against the expanding blue canopy. These were the noddy terns and the boobies, the sacred, airborne messengers of the land. Unlike the solitary albatross or the wandering frigate bird that could roam the open ocean for months at a time without ever touching solid ground, these specific coastal birds possessed a strict biological tether to the earth. The fundamental rule of the navigator was elegantly simple and completely infallible. These coastal hunters flew out to sea at the break of dawn to fish, but they were compelled by the laws of nature to return to their terrestrial nests before nightfall. To a master navigator who had spent weeks staring at nothing but the shifting boundary between water and sky, the presence of these birds in the morning air was a living, breathing compass needle. The elder watched their flight patterns with a profound, quiet reverence. He carefully noted the precise angle of their trajectory and the purposeful speed of their hunting dives. By observing the birds flying away from the rising sun, he knew exactly where their island home lay hidden behind the curvature of the earth. If they had spotted the birds at dusk, the strategy would simply be to follow them in the exact direction they were flying, cross-referencing this sudden burst of biological activity with the underlying swell pattern the boy had felt during the night. The old man found absolute certainty. A subtle nod to the weary crew signalled them to adjust the massive triangular sails, catching the morning trade winds to follow their avian guides. The birds were not simply flying aimlessly over the water. They were commuting along invisible highways of air, drawing a direct, indisputable line between the deep ocean feeding grounds and the shores of their destination. The canoe glided forward with renewed energy, the water hissing softly against the carved wooden hulls as the immense tension of the long voyage finally began to melt away into the warming air. Hours later, as the midday sun bathed the Pacific in a blinding crystalline light, the horizon finally broke its unbroken line. What began as a faint, charcoal smudge against the azure sky slowly solidified into a towering, magnificent silhouette. It was the majestic emerald peaks of the northernmost point of the Polynesian Triangle, a place that would one day be known as the Hawaiian Archipelago. The sheer scale of the volcanic islands was breathtaking, rising from the sea like dormant giants wrapped in a soft mantle of white clinging clouds. This was a sudden eruption of vibrant life and solid rock in a world that had consisted entirely of liquid and air for countless weeks. Lush, verdant valleys spilled down into pristine, untouched coastlines, and the distant, thunderous roar of surf crashing against shallow coral reefs drifted across the water like a welcoming song. The boy stood at the heavy wooden bow, his heart swelling with an indescribable mixture of triumph and profound relief, realizing that the terrifying ocean had never been a barrier, but rather a nurturing bridge that had carried them safely home. The massive catamaran finally slipped to the calm, turquoise waters of a sheltered lagoon, the crew dropping the heavy stone anchors into the vibrant coral gardens below. They had successfully navigated millions of square miles of trackless ocean, armed with nothing but the stars in their minds, the rhythm of the waves in their bodies, and the flight of the birds in the sky. This serene arrival marked one of the greatest feats of human endurance and intellect in the ancient world, a testament to a civilization perfectly attuned to the subtle whispers of nature. But this golden era of navigation, this profound harmony between humanity and the cosmos, was about to vanish in the fog of history. For hundreds of years following that triumphant arrival, the archipelago thrived in a state of splendid isolation, cradled by the vast expanse of the Pacific. Generations of navigators continued to read the sacred language of the stars, passing down the complex mental maps and the subtle rhythms of the ocean currents through deeply revered oral traditions. The massive double-hulled canoes remained the lifeblood of these island societies, connecting distant shores with a web of invisible celestial highways. But the relentless wheel of time brought a different kind of vessel to the horizon, ships constructed not of hollowed koa, wood and woven pandanus, but of heavy iron, canvas, and eventually, the churning engines of steam. The ocean, once an infinite canvas of spiritual and physical exploration, slowly began to shrink under the weight of foreign ambitions. The arrival of explorers, whalers, and merchants from the distant west brought a profound structural shift to the rhythm of island life. They carried with them a completely alien paradigm of navigation, relying on physical compasses, brass sextants, and flat, printed maps that reduced the living, breathing ocean to mere coordinates on paper. As the 19th century progressed, the strategic allure of the islands drew the intense gaze of a rising power across the eastern waters. The creeping influence of American business interests and political manoeuvring began to reshape the very fabric of the society, subtly at first, and then with an overwhelming, absolute force. The ancient knowledge of the wayfinders, once the most exalted and vital skill in the Polynesian world, was suddenly marginalised, dismissed by the new arrivals as mere folklore or primitive guesswork. This tragic erosion of culture reached its devastating climax with the eventual overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom and its formal annexation into a new foreign republic. The native language, the very vessel that held the intricate terminology of the star compasses and the ocean swells, was systematically suppressed in the newly established Western schools. Without the language, the ancient chants that served as the navigational encyclopedias of the people began to fade into a heartbreaking silence. Along the pristine coastlines, the magnificent voyaging canoes, masterpieces of indigenous engineering that had conquered the greatest ocean on Earth, were left to rot on the beaches. Their beautifully carved hulls surrendered to the punishing sun and the creeping salt, slowly disintegrating into the white sand as the younger generations were pushed to look toward the sugar plantations and the industrial ports rather than the infinite horizon. The final custodians of this celestial wisdom found themselves stranded in a rapidly modernizing world that no longer had a place for their magic. An aging master navigator, his skin weathered by decades of salt spray, and his mind still perfectly aligned with the zenith star, would sit on the darkened shores, gazing up at the glittering canopy. He still knew the exact path to Tahiti, and still felt the precise angle of the trade winds, but there was no one left to receive the sacred transmission. The strict traditions that governed the intense, decade-long apprenticeship required to train a new wayfinder could no longer be maintained in a society fractured by colonial rule. The elders carried entire universes in their minds, holding the accumulated genius of 3,000 years of exploration. Yet, they were forced to take these magnificent cosmic maps with them into the grave. By the middle of the 20th century, the profound darkness of the Pacific night was completely devoid of the silent, gliding silhouettes of the traditional voyaging canoes. The art of wayfinding was entirely presumed extinct, relegated to the dusty archives of anthropologists and the tragic sepia-toned memory of a vanquished era. The stars continued their eternal, silent rotation above the volcanic peaks. But the eyes that knew how to read their sweeping arcs were gone. A profound, suffocating amnesia had settled over the Pacific, severing the deep, spiritual tether between the islanders and the ocean that had given them life. But beneath this heavy blanket of forgotten history, the ancient navigational knowledge was not entirely extinguished. It was merely waiting in the deepest shadows of a distant atoll, ready to be awakened by a new generation desperate to remember who they truly were. By the time the calendar turned to the 1970s, the landscape of the Hawaiian Islands had been thoroughly transformed into a modern American state. Towering concrete hotels cast long, angular shadows over the legendary beaches of Waikiki, and the ancient coastal fish ponds had long been paved over to make way for bustling, multi-lane highways. A new generation of islanders had grown up entirely within the West educational system, separated from their ancestral language, and taught that the great Polynesian migrations were merely accidents of the wind. The prevailing academic theory of the era suggested that the ancient seafarers simply drifted aimlessly on ocean currents, incapable of purposeful, two-way navigation across thousands of miles of open sea. Yet beneath the veneer of modern industrial life, a quiet but profound cultural restlessness was beginning to stir among the youth. They felt a deep, unexplainable void, an inherited grief for a majestic past that had been systematically erased from the official textbooks of their time. This collective yearning soon coalesced into a powerful cultural reawakening, a movement that would become known as the Hawaiian Renaissance. A small, fiercely dedicated group of anthropologists, artists, and community leaders decided that the only way to restore the dignity of their ancestors was to recreate their greatest technological triumph. They envisioned building a massive, traditional double-hulled voyaging canoe, completely free of modern navigational instruments, and sailing it all the way to Tahiti just as the ancients had done centuries before. They named this audacious dream Hokulea, after the joyous zenith star that had always guided the wayfinders safely home. The construction of the vessel became a profoundly spiritual endeavour, drawing people from all walks of life to meticulously lash the massive wooden hulls together with miles of traditional cordage. As the beautiful, curved shape of the canoe slowly materialised on the shore, it became a powerful physical symbol of indigenous pride and resilience. Among those drawn to the deep, resonant call of the Hokulea was a young man named Nainoa Thompson. Growing up in the vibrant urban valleys of Honolulu, he had always felt an inexplicable pull toward the ocean, spending his days studying the subtle movements of the waves and the shifting patterns of the trade winds. He possessed the innate physical instincts of a waterman, but the ancient cognitive science of the star compass was entirely foreign to him. The founders of the Voyaging Project quickly realised they faced a monumental and terrifying problem that money and modern engineering could not solve. They had successfully resurrected the physical vessel, but the software required to sail it across the trackless Pacific, the mind of the master navigator, had been completely wiped out from the Polynesian Triangle. The beautifully crafted canoe was ready to conquer the waves, but without a human compass to guide it, it was nothing more than a stunning piece of floating art. The desperate search for living knowledge forced the group to look far beyond their own familiar waters, casting their gaze across the vast, scattered archipelagos of the Western Pacific. Their quest eventually led them thousands of miles away to Satawal, a tiny isolated coral atoll in the Caroline Islands of Micronesia. Here, completely untouched by the rapid industrialization that had swept across the rest of the ocean, the ancient ways had miraculously survived. The island was so remote that the relentless march of modern technology had simply bypassed it, preserving a pure, unbroken lineage of traditional wayfinding. In this quiet, sun-bleached corner of the sea, they found a man who still held the entire cosmos within his mind, a quiet, intensely focused fisherman whose knowledge of the stars was as natural to him as breathing. His name was Maupiailug, and he represented the very last of a dying breed of master navigators who had been initiated into the sacred, secretive arts of the ocean since early childhood. Mao possessed a fierce, uncompromising intelligence and an aura of absolute authority that immediately commanded respect from everyone who crossed his path. When the emissaries from Hawaii approached him with their audacious plan to sail the Hokula to Tahiti, they were asking him to navigate a route he had never personally travelled, across an ocean space far larger than his native waters. Furthermore, sharing the closely guarded secrets of his people with outsiders was considered a profound breach of traditional protocol. Yet, Mao looked into the eyes of the young sailors and saw a reflection of a tragic future he deeply feared for his own people. He understood that if he did not share the light of his knowledge, the entire legacy of Pacific navigation would be swallowed by the darkness forever. In an act of unprecedented generosity and cultural solidarity, Mao agreed to leave the quiet shores of Satawal and travel to the bustling ports of America to teach a new generation how to see the ocean through the eyes of their ancestors. He became the vital bridge across centuries of forgotten history, the sudden spark that would reignite a dormant civilization. As he stepped onto the freshly carved wooden decks of the Hoku Leia, the young crew watched him with a mixture of absolute awe and quiet trepidation. The physical preparations were finally complete, and the stars were aligning in the vast expanse above. But the true test of their courage, and the ultimate vindication of 1,000 years of oceanic genius, was only just beginning. On a warm, breathless morning in the spring of 1976, the bustling shores of the Hawaiian Islands bore witness to an event that seemed to defy the very logic of the modern industrial age. The magnificent double-hulled voyaging canoe, crafted from sacred koa wood and bound together with thousands of feet of hand-tied cordage, finally rested upon the gentle swells of the turquoise harbour. A massive crowd of onlookers, deeply divided between sceptical modern observers and hopeful descendants of ancient seafarers, lined the sun-drenched docks to watch history unfold. Before a single rope was cast off or a single sail unfurled, a quiet ceremony took place on the wooden deck that would define the entire soul of the voyage. The crew members stepped forward one by one to surrender every single artifact of contemporary civilization they had brought aboard for safety and convenience. Modern pocket watches, heavy brass compasses, battery-operated transistor radios, and detailed navigational charts printed by government cartographers were gathered together and placed into a single wooden box. That box was handed back to the shore, leaving the vessel entirely stripped of the mechanical crutches that defined 20th century American life. They were stepping backward through time into a terrifying vacuum of knowledge, choosing to trust their lives entirely to an unproven ancient system that had not been tested across the open ocean in over 600 years. Nainoa Thompson stood near the massive steering paddle, feeling the crushing weight of responsibility settle deep into his chest as he looked out toward the endless, shimmering horizon. Beside him, the quiet master navigator from Micronesia maintained a look of serene, unshakable calm, his weathered face turned toward the open sea where the true test of human memory awaited them. With a soft creak of ancient timbers and the gentle whisper of the morning trade winds catching the triangular woven sails, the canoe slowly slipped away from the dock and cut through the emerald waters of the harbour. The cheering crowds on the shore gradually faded into a distant murmur, swallowed by the vast, echoing expanse of the open Pacific, as the island peaks slowly sank beneath the western edge of the world. As the afternoon sun began its slow, majestic descent toward the water, casting long golden ribbons across the rolling swells, the reality of their complete isolation set in with absolute finality. There was no radio contact to tether them to the bustling cities they had left behind, no satellite tracking to watch their progress, and no safety net of modern rescue vessels should the unpredictable ocean turn against them. They were utterly alone on a floating island of wood and fibre, completely dependent upon the silent cooperation between the cosmos above and the human mind within. The first night at sea descended with a profound, velvet darkness that seemed to swallow the universe, leaving only the endless dome of glittering stars suspended directly above the swaying mast. Without the harsh glare of urban streetlights or the ambient glow of coastal highways, the celestial map revealed itself in breathtaking, terrifying clarity, looking much the same as it had appeared to the ancient navigators millennia ago. Maupielug did not sleep, choosing instead to remain stationed near the bow, his quiet gaze fixed upward as he began to read the invisible celestial houses that arched across the midnight sky. He watched the zenith stars as they climbed to their highest points, translating the ancient stellar geometry into a living, breathing course that guided the wooden hulls through the dark, churning water. The crew moved about the deck with hushed and reverent whispers, learning to coordinate their physical movements with the subtle pitch and roll of the ocean swells beneath them. Days melted into weeks as the canoe steadily carved its lonely path southward through the vast, watery wilderness, locked in an eternal rhythm of wind, wave, and starlight. The initial anxiety that had gripped the hearts of the younger sailors gradually dissolved, replaced by a deep, meditative focus born from the unbroken silence of the open ocean. They watched flying fish dance across the crests of rolling waves, and tracked the purposeful trajectories of coastal seabirds that soared high above the mast, treating every natural phenomenon as a sacred letter in an unfolding cosmic message. In the modern world, with its frantic pace, its ringing telephones, and its towering concrete monuments, felt like a distant, faded dream from another lifetime. Out here on the Pacific, there was only the vast, breathing sea, the eternal rotation of the heavens, and the quiet, unbroken courage of a people reclaiming their rightful place among the stars. After 34 relentless days of tracking the silent movement of the stars and listening to the hidden language of the ocean swells, a faint, dark smudge finally materialized along the far edge of the southern horizon. To the weary crew, whose hands had grown calloused against the rough lines and wooden steering oars, that indistinct shadow carried the weight of 1,000 answered prayers. In Maupialug, standing motionless at the bow with his gaze fixed immovably ahead, recognized the subtle refraction of the swells long before the physical outline of the island became visible to the naked eye. The seabirds that had accompanied them for hundreds of miles began to change their flight patterns, circling with a renewed urgency that spoke of nearby shorelines and deep, sheltered valleys. The heavy, humid breeze carried the distinct, unmistakable scent of damp tropical earth and blossoming hibiscus flowers, whispering a quiet promise of sanctuary across the blue expanse. Every muscle in the bodies of the young sailors ached from the unyielding motion of the deck, yet an electric current of profound anticipation surged through the entire vessel as they drew closer to their destination. They had crossed more than 2,000 miles of open, trackless water without a single mechanical instrument, trusting only the ancient wisdom etched into the human mind and the timeless guidance of the cosmos. As the majestic peaks of Tahiti slowly rose from the ocean haze, revealing emerald valleys draped in heavy morning mist, the true magnitude of what they had achieved began to settle over the floating canoe. Rounding the final headland, the crew was met with a breathtaking, emotional spectacle that left them completely speechless. The shores of the harbour were blanketed by a massive, moving tapestry of humanity, with more than half the island's population gathered along the water's edge to witness the impossible return of the ancient voyagers. The air instantly filled with the thunderous, earth-shaking roar of traditional conch shell trumpets, deep-throated chants of welcome, and the resonant pounding of wooden drums that echoed across the turquoise bay. Thousands of cheering voices blended into a single overwhelming wave of sound, carrying centuries of shared Polynesian heritage, brotherhood, and collective memory. Tears streamed freely down the weathered faces of Nainoa Thompson and his exhausted crew as they guided the Hokulea gently toward the shallow sand. They were not merely visitors arriving on a foreign shore, they were living proof that their ancestors had been master navigators capable of deliberate, courageous exploration across the vastest ocean on Earth. In the quiet years that followed that historic voyage, the Hokulea would go on to traverse hundreds of thousands of miles across the globe, carrying its message of cultural pride and environmental stewardship to ports around the world. Yet the deepest journey of all had taken place entirely within the collective consciousness of a people who had successfully bridged the gap between a forgotten past and a vibrant future. The stars that had guided the ancient mariners across the trackless deep remained unchanged, fixed in their eternal dance above the turning earth, waiting patiently for anyone willing to look up and listen. The night sky above the Pacific was no longer an empty, terrifying void of darkness, but a familiar map of ancestral light, whispering the timeless story of human courage, brilliance, and endurance. As the gentle ocean swells rolled endlessly toward the shore, the great canoe rested quietly in its harbour, having successfully proven that no civilization is ever truly lost, as long as its children remember how to find their way home. The vast Pacific, which once seemed like an impassable barrier designed to separate human communities from one another, became instead the grand highway that united them through an unbroken lineage of courage, exploration, and shared heritage. Now, the traditional double-hulled canoes are safely moored now, their woven sails folded away beneath the quiet tropical stars. But the great journey of human discovery itself has never truly ended. It continues in every tranquil moment when someone steps outside into the cool evening air, looks up at the infinite expanse of the cosmos, and feels a sudden, inexplicable connection to those who charted the unknown ages before us. The night deepens further, wrapping the world in a soft velvet blanket of absolute silence as the gentle, unhurried rotation of the earth carries us effortlessly through the quiet spaces between the stars. There is nothing left to solve, no urgent task demanding attention, and no distant horizon left to conquer under the peaceful expanse of the midnight sky. Let the cares of the waking day drift away on the receding tide, leaving behind only the steady, rhythmic breathing of the sea and the timeless light of the stars watching quietly over your rest.